Caleb Whitmore threw his entire life savings onto that auction table without flinching because a woman he had never spoken to was about to lose the only thing her dead father had left her. Nobody in Red Canyon moved. Nobody breathed. Charlotte Bennett stood straight as a fence post in July heat, jaw set, eyes burning, refusing to let a single tear fall in front of the man who had destroyed her family. She had prayed for a miracle. She hadn't prayed for a mountain cowboy who smelled like pine and trouble. If you believe one person can change everything, subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. And let's find out just how far this story travels. The summer of 1885 came to Red Canyon, Wyoming, like it always did, hot and merciless, baking the dirt roads to hard clay and turning the creek down by Miller's Crossing into something barely worth calling water. But the heat that pressed down on the town square that particular Tuesday morning in July had nothing to do with the sun. It had everything to do with Richard Caldwell. He stood on the steps of the land office with a leather-bound ledger tucked under one arm and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, surrounded by 3 men who worked for him and did whatever he said without asking why. He was 50 years old, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black wool coat that cost more than most families in Red Canyon earned in 6 months. He had the look of a man who had never lost anything, because he had made certain over 20 years that losing was something that happened to other people. The crowd had gathered the way crowds always gathered when something bad was about to become official. Ranchers and their wives, shopkeepers leaning in doorways, a few women who clutched their handbags and watched with the particular expression of people who knew they should say something and had already decided they wouldn't. Charlotte Bennett stood at the edge of that crowd alone. She was 27 years old, and she had been awake since 4 in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table in the house she had grown up in, reading through her father's papers for the 4th time in 3 days, looking for something she knew she wasn't going to find. She had her mother's dark hair pinned back from her face, her father's stubbornness in the set of her shoulders, and a blue cotton dress that was clean because she'd spent an hour the night before making sure it was. Because she had decided that whatever happened today, she was not going to look like someone who had already given up. She hadn't eaten breakfast. Her hands were steady. William Bennett had died 6 weeks ago of a fever that came on fast and took him in 4 days. He was 53 years old, and he had run the Bennett land, 412 acres, on the eastern slope above Red Canyon for 30 years. He had borrowed money twice in his life. The first time was to build the house after he married Charlotte's mother. The second time was 18 months ago, and Charlotte still didn't fully understand why. Because her father had never explained it, and then he had died before she could make him. What she understood was this: the note was held by Caldwell's bank. The amount was $4,000, and her father had made no payments. She had gone to the bank 3 weeks after the funeral, dressed in black, with her father's ledgers under her arm. She had sat across from Gerald Marsh, who managed Caldwell's finances and had the particular quality of a man who had learned to feel nothing in order to keep his job. "Miss Bennett," Gerald had said, folding his hands on the desk. "I understand this is a difficult time." "Mr. Marsh," she had answered, "I'd like to discuss restructuring the terms." He had looked at her the way men like him always looked at women like her, not with disrespect. Exactly, but with a kind of patient certainty that the conversation was going to end the way he had already decided it would end. "I'm afraid Mr. Caldwell has been quite clear. The note is in default. The land will go to auction on the 15th. My father paid taxes on that land for 30 years. "Yes, ma'am, 412 acres. The south pasture alone is worth more than the debt." "Yes, ma'am, then why won't he negotiate?" Gerald had looked at his folded hands. "That's a question for Mr. Caldwell." She had gone to see Caldwell himself the following week. He had received her in his parlor, a large, carefully arranged room that was meant to impress, and he had offered her tea and listened He said with an expression of such practiced sympathy that she had believed for the first 30 seconds. Charlotte, he had said, not Miss Bennet. Charlotte. As though they were old friends, as though he hadn't just taken everything. Your father was a proud man. Too proud to come to me when things got difficult. I wish he had. He borrowed from your bank, she said. He came to you. Under unfortunate circumstances. Caldwell set down his teacup. The land will fetch a good price at auction. After the debt is settled, there may be something left over for you. That land belongs to my family. He looked at her with something that might have been pity if pity were made of stone. It belonged to your family. These things change, my dear. I'm sorry. She had not cried in his parlor. She had not cried walking home. She had sat in her father's chair that night and let herself shake for about 10 minutes. And then she had stood up, washed her face, and started thinking. For 3 weeks she had written letters to the Territorial Land Office, to the county judge, to 2 lawyers whose names she had found in the newspaper. The Territorial Land Office sent back a form response. The county judge, Harlan Webb, a man who played cards with Caldwell on Friday nights, wrote 3 sentences expressing his regrets. One lawyer wrote back, saying he couldn't take the case. The other didn't write back at all. Pastor Elkins told her to have faith. Dorothy Marsh, Gerald's wife, who had known Charlotte's mother for 20 years, brought over a pie and wouldn't meet her eyes. Tom Aldridge, who owned the hardware store and had sold her father lumber for the barn roof just 2 years ago, crossed the street when he saw her coming. Nobody wanted Caldwell's attention turned toward them. So Charlotte Bennet stood alone at the edge of the crowd on that Tuesday morning in July and watched Richard Caldwell step up to the auction podium. And she breathed slowly and kept her hands still and told herself she was not going to give him the satisfaction of watching her break. The Bennet property, Caldwell said, not looking at her. His voice carrying easily across the square, 412 acres. Eastern Slope, water rights to Miller's Creek tributary, to be sold in settlement of a debt of $4,000 as held by Canyon Trust and Lending. Bidding will open at I want to see the original note. Her own voice surprised her. She hadn't planned to speak, but the words were out and the crowd had turned, and Caldwell was looking at her now with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not quite irritation, not quite surprise, something colder than either. I beg your pardon, he said. Charlotte stepped forward. Every person between her and the podium stepped back, and she walked through the gap they made until she was standing close enough to see the weathering on his coat collar. Close enough to make this personal. The original loan document. I want to see it. The one my father signed. Miss Bennet, this is a legal proceeding. Then it should have documentation. Her voice didn't shake. She was honestly surprised by that. Show me the note my father signed. Show me his signature on a document agreeing to $4,000 at whatever terms you're claiming he agreed to. A murmur moved through the crowd, like wind through dry grass. Caldwell's expression settled into something flat and certain. I don't believe this is the time or place for. It's exactly the time and place. She held his gaze. Because you're about to auction off land my family has worked for 30 years. And I am asking you in front of every person in this town to show me the paperwork that justifies it. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. And then Caldwell opened the ledger he was holding, turned 3 pages and held it out toward her. Satisfied, she took the ledger. She looked at the document. Her father's signature was there. She knew his handwriting on a note dated 18 months ago. $4,000. The interest rate was printed in small, neat figures in the column beside it. She looked at the interest rate. She looked at it again. This rate, she said. This is, Caldwell said, fully legal under territorial statute. It's usury. It's business. He reached out and took the ledger back with the ease of a man removing something from a child. Now, as I was saying, bidding will open. That was when they heard the horse. It wasn't the sound of one horse. It was the particular sound of a horse that had been ridden hard for several hours, and was still moving at a pace that said its rider wasn't interested in slowing down for the comfort of the animal or the people in his way. The crowd shifted and turned, looking north toward the main road, and the dust cloud resolved itself into a single rider on a big gray horse, coming in from the direction of the mountains. He didn't slow down until he was 20 feet from the edge of the crowd. Then he pulled up, and the gray horse stopped so sudden and so complete that it might have been made of stone. And the man on its back swung down before the animal had fully stopped moving. Charlotte watched him walk through the crowd the same way she had walked through it a minute ago, people moving aside without quite knowing why they were doing it, and she had the very clear, very specific thought that she had never seen this man before in her life. He was tall, not the tallest man she'd ever seen, but there was something about the way he held himself that made him seem like he took up more space than he physically occupied. He wore a canvas shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, trousers tucked into worn boots, and a hat that had been good once and was now just honest. He had dark hair and a short beard and eyes that were some color between gray and blue that Charlotte couldn't name and wasn't sure she needed to. He looked like a man who spent most of his time above the tree line and wasn't entirely comfortable below it. He stopped beside her, not in front of her, beside her. He looked at Caldwell. Caldwell looked at him. "Caleb Whitmore," Caldwell said. And something moved behind his eyes, something that was not quite fear but was related to it, the way thunder is related to lightning. "You've been up on that mountain. So long I assumed you'd forgotten there was a world down here." "I remember enough of it," Caleb said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had spent years talking to horses and sky, and found human conversation slightly less reliable than either. He reached into the saddlebag that was still strapped to the gray horse's flank. The horse had followed him through the crowd like a dog, and pulled out a canvas bag that landed on the auction podium, with a sound that was impossible to misidentify. Gold makes a specific sound when it hits wood. Everyone in the crowd knew it. "That's $4,200, Caleb said. "The debt, plus interest at the legal rate, which, as the lady just pointed out, is considerably less than the rate on that note." Caldwell's face did something complicated. "You can't just," says a debt can be settled by a third party prior to foreclosure action being completed, Caleb said. He said it the way a man states something he learned long ago and hasn't forgotten. "I reckon this auction hasn't started yet, since I didn't hear an opening bid. So the foreclosure action isn't complete." He looked at Caldwell steadily. "Is it?" The county recorder, a small, dry man named August Pitts, who did not work for Caldwell but was deeply afraid of him, was standing 3 feet away. He looked at his papers. He looked at the bag of gold. He looked at the crowd looking at him. "He's August Pitts said, and then cleared his throat. "He's correct, Mr. Caldwell. Technically, this is my auction," Caldwell said. His voice had gone very quiet, which Charlotte suspected was more dangerous than loud. "On my property. The property isn't yours yet," Caleb said. "That's why we're all standing here." Charlotte was staring at him. She wasn't sure she had ever, in her 27 years, been so aware that she did not understand what was happening. This man, this mountain cowboy who smelled like pine resin and horse and dust, had just ridden down from wherever he lived with enough gold to settle her father's debt. And he was standing beside her, like this was something he had planned. Like she was someone he knew, like this moment made sense. It did not make sense. "Who are you?" she said. She meant it to sound composed. It came out something closer to raw. He turned to look at her, and she had the brief, disconcerting experience of being looked at by someone who was actually looking at her, not at her situation, not at what she could offer or what she represented, but at her specifically. He touched the brim of his hat. The gesture was plain and unperformed. "Caleb Whitmore." "Ma'am, I run a small operation about 12 miles up, on the north slope." "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a second in the way that suggested he was deciding how much of the truth to give her. "Your father asked me to look out for you," he said. if things went wrong. The words landed on Charlotte with the full weight of every night she had sat up alone, reading papers and writing letters, and not understanding what her father had been thinking in the last year of his life. She felt something shift in her chest, not grief. She had moved through the sharpest part of the grief, but something adjacent to it. The particular ache of discovering that someone had been trying to protect you in ways you didn't know about until it was too late to thank them. She did not cry. She lifted her chin instead. "I didn't ask for help," she said. "No, Cape, your father did. And I gave him my word." Caldwell had not moved from behind the podium. He was watching this exchange with the expression of a man who was adding up numbers and not liking the total. "Whitmore," he said, "you're making an enemy today." Caleb looked at him with something that Charlotte would spend time thinking about later, a look that was not anger and not contempt, but was something quieter and somehow more absolute than either. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "I live 12 miles up a mountain. I don't come down here much, but when I do, I tend to notice the shape of things." He picked the canvas bag up off the podium and set it directly in front of August Pitts. "Count it out and give Miss Bennett her receipt." The crowd watched August Pitts count the gold. Nobody spoke. Caldwell stood very still. When it was done, August Pitts wrote out a receipt in his careful, small handwriting and handed it to Charlotte with hands that weren't quite steady. "The debt is settled," he said. "Miss Bennett, the property remains in your name." She held the receipt. She looked at it for a moment. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. And she turned to face Caldwell, because she had decided 3 weeks ago that if she ever got through this, she was going to face him, not walk away from him. "My father built that land," she said. "My mother is buried on that land. And whatever you think you're owed, Mr. Caldwell, I promise you it isn't that." Caldwell looked at her. Then he looked at Caleb. Then he looked at his 3 men, who were watching with expressions that suggested they were waiting to be told what to do, and were hoping they weren't going to be told to do it right now. "This isn't finished," Caldwell said. "No," Charlotte answered. "I expect it isn't." His men followed. The crowd watched them go, and then slowly, with the specific energy of people who had witnessed something they weren't sure they understood, began to disperse. Charlotte stood where she was. Caleb stood beside her. The gray horse nosed at her shoulder, and she reached up automatically and put her hand against its neck, because it was something to do with her hands. "You should ride out tonight," Caleb said. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the direction Caldwell had walked. "Not stay at the house. It's my house." "Yes, ma'am. And the 3 men Caldwell brought today will know it's empty when you're sleeping in it." He glanced at her then. "He doesn't like losing. In my experience, men like him get dangerous when they don't get what they want." Charlotte looked at him. "You know him. I know the type." He paused. "I may know him specifically." "What does that mean?" He was quiet again in that deliberate way. "It means your father didn't borrow $4,000 because he was careless with money. And it means the debt on that note was structured the way it was for a reason." He finally looked at her directly. "There are things I need to tell you. Not here, Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully. "You've just spent what I imagine is a significant portion of your personal savings to settle a debt for a woman you've never spoken to, based on a promise to a man who is no longer alive to confirm you made it. You understand how that sounds?" "Yes, ma'am. And yet you want me to ride out of town tonight based on your advice." "I want you to be safe," he said. "Whether you take my advice is your business." She studied him. He stood still under her examination without visible discomfort, not defensive. Not performing patience, just waiting. The way a man waits who is accustomed to long stretches of time silence and knows that neither of them will hurt him. "Where would you suggest I go?" she asked. "My place," he said. "It's defensible. It's far enough from town that Caldwell's men won't bother making the ride tonight. And I have a second room." He met her eyes. "Your father trusted me." "Miss Bennett, I understand you have no reason to yet. But I think before tomorrow, you're going to want to hear what I know. It was the yet that did it." Not the money, not the rescue, not the gold bag and the legal citation and the dramatic entrance. The word yet. As though her trust was something that would be earned, not assumed. As though he understood that a woman who had spent 6 weeks losing everything to men who believed her compliance was their due might need to hear that her trust was not considered a given. "I'll need to get my father's papers," she said. "Yes, ma'am. I'll need a few hours. I'll be at the livery." She nodded once and walked toward her house and did not look back. Because she had decided weeks ago that she was not going to be a woman who looked back. Caleb watched her go. Tom Aldridge, who had crossed the street to avoid her 3 days ago, materialized at Caleb's elbow with the sheesh look of a man trying to decide if he could attach himself to the winning side, now that a winning side had been established. "Quite a thing you did there," Tom said. Caleb looked at him. "She's been in this town 6 weeks fighting this alone," he said. "You live 40 feet from her house." He let that sit for a moment. Then he walked toward the livery, and the gray horse followed him. And Tom Aldridge stood where he was looking at the ground. The house felt different in the afternoon light. Charlotte had grown up in these rooms, had learned to read at that table, had helped her mother put up preserves in that kitchen, had sat with her father on winter evenings while he read aloud from books he thought she ought to know. The house was full of the particular quality of a place that has absorbed 30 years of a family living in it. And she was going to have to leave it, at least for tonight. Because a mountain cowboy she'd met 2 hours ago was probably right that Caldwell's men would come. She gathered her father's papers first. There were 2 boxes of them. And she went through them quickly, with the efficiency of someone who had already done this 3 times. Pulling out the things she thought might matter and leaving the rest. Deeds, correspondence, her father's personal ledger, the one he kept separate from the business accounts, with his careful handwriting recording every transaction for 20 years. She found in the bottom of the second box an envelope she hadn't seen before. It was sealed. Her name was on the front in her father's handwriting. Not Charlotte, not Miss Bennett, just Charlotte, the way he had called her since she was small. She sat down at the table and held it. Then she put it in her coat pocket without opening it. Because she wasn't ready, and she finished gathering the papers. And she looked around at the house for a long moment. And she picked up her bag and walked out. Caleb was at the livery with both horses saddled. He had bought her horse a bay mare named Clara that she'd raised from a foal out of the livery stable, where she'd had to board it 3 weeks ago when she couldn't afford the feed. She stopped when she saw that and looked at him. "Add it to the account," she said. Because she needed to say something. He nodded and handed her the reins. They rode north out of Red Canyon in the long gold light of late afternoon, past the church and the schoolhouse, and up the road that turned to a track that turned to something barely worth calling a path as the mountains rose around them. Charlotte rode without speaking, and so did Caleb, and the silence between them was not as comfortable in the specific way that silence is not uncomfortable between 2 people who are both accustomed to their own company. After an hour, she said, "How did you know my father?" He was quiet for a minute, not avoiding the question. She was beginning to understand, just considering how to answer it accurately. "He came up to the North Slope about 2 years ago. Said he'd heard I did survey work." A pause. "Said he needed a man who could read land and keep his mouth shut. Survey work. I spent 8 years working for the Denver and Pacific as a land assessor before I moved up here," he said. "I know how to read what's underground, mineral deposits, water table, what land is worth based on what's in, not just what's on it." Charlotte thought about that. "My father hired you to survey his land. He hired me to survey a specific part of his land," Caleb said. "The northeast quarter, the part that runs up against the Caldwell holdings on the ridge." She looked at him. And I found something he hadn't expected to find." He kept his eyes on the track ahead. "I'm going to show you the report when we get there. But what I can tell you now is that your father's land, that particular quarter section, sits on top of one of the largest silver deposits I've encountered in 15 years of doing this work. The world went very quiet in Charlotte's ears. "Silver," she said. "Yes, ma'am." And Caldwell had his own man do a survey 2 years before that. His man was good enough to know the deposit was there, but not specific enough to know exactly where it ran. Caleb glanced at her. "It runs under your land." "So the debt," Charlotte said. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, very flat. Very careful, the voice of someone doing arithmetic. "The note my father signed. The impossible interest rate. Your father borrowed money he didn't need. From a man who was watching and waiting, because by the time I gave him my report, he already knew Caldwell was going to come for it. He was trying to buy time." Caleb's jaw set briefly. "He wrote to me 2 months before he died. Said the fever was bad. Said if he didn't make it, I should look after you. Said there were papers he'd left that I'd need to find." Charlotte pressed her hand against the pocket where the letter was. "He left me a letter," she said. Caleb looked at her. "I haven't opened it yet," she said. He nodded once. And looked back at the path, and didn't say anything. And she was grateful for that, for being given the right to carry her father's last words a little longer in the dark of her pocket before she had to let them out. They reached the ranch in the last of the evening light. It sat in a natural clearing on the north slope, a solid, practical building that a man had built for function, not show, with a barn and a small outbuilding, and a creek running along the eastern edge that caught the sunset and turned it to something briefly extraordinary. Charlotte looked at it. "It's not much," Caleb said. "It's exactly what it needs to be," she said, and she meant it. She took care of her own horse. He didn't offer to do it for her. Which told her something she filed away. They went inside. And he lit the lamp and built up the fire for cooking, and pulled out a wooden box from under the workbench. Along the wall, a box she could see was full of papers. Maps, documents folded and carefully labeled in the specific way of a man who was trained to create records that held up. He put the box on the table. "His survey report," he said. "And my copy of the documentation. Everything I found. Everything I recorded, and a letter your father wrote to me that he said I should keep in case he wasn't around, to speak for himself." Charlotte looked at the box. Then she reached into her pocket and took out the letter with her name on it. She broke the seal. Her father's handwriting, his specific, careful, slightly cramped handwriting that she had known all her life. "Charlotte, if you're reading this, things went the way I feared they would. Don't grieve too long. I haven't got the time to explain everything, but Caleb Whitmore knows the rest. Trust him. I know that's asking a lot when you've had little reason to trust men lately. But he kept his word to me when he didn't have to. And in my experience, that's the measure of a man. The land is yours. The proof of it is in those mountains, and a good man knows where to find it. Fight for it. Your father." She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it back in her pocket and looked up at Caleb, who was standing on the other side of the table, looking at the box of papers and giving her the moment. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "Show me everything." He pulled out the survey report. He pulled out the maps. He spread them on the table, and he started talking, not performing for her. Not simplifying because she was a woman, just explaining clearly what he had found and how he had found it and what it meant. And Charlotte listened with the particular quality of attention she brought to everything important, and asked questions when she needed to, and began to understand the full shape of what her father had known, and what Caldwell had wanted, and why none of this had ever really been about a debt. Outside, the Wyoming mountains held the last of the daylight. Inside, two people who had both lost things they hadn't expected to lose sat across a table covered in maps and started, very carefully, to figure out how to take something back. They worked until midnight. Charlotte didn't notice the hours passing. She noticed the maps, the careful lines of Caleb's survey work, the cross-sections showing what lay beneath the surface of the northeast quarter, the elevation charts marked in his precise hand. She noticed the numbers. She had always been good with numbers, had kept her father's account since she was 15. and the numbers on these maps told a story that made her feel simultaneously vindicated and sick. The silver deposit ran northeast to southwest across approximately 60 acres of Bennett land. Caleb's assessment, written in the dry, technical language of a man trained to be accurate rather than dramatic, estimated the accessible ore at a value that Charlotte read twice and then read a third time before she trusted that she was seeing the right figures. "This is," she said, and stopped. "Yes," he said. "This is why he borrowed money he didn't need. He needed a paper trail," Caleb said. He was sitting across the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and he wrapped both hands around it the way men do when they're not thinking about the cup. He knew Caldwell had suspicions. He figured if Caldwell thought the Bennett operation was in financial trouble, it might buy him time to secure the claim legally before Caldwell found a way to take it. But Caldwell moved faster. Caldwell always moves faster. He's been doing this for 20 years. Caleb set the cup down. The men who do what he does, they don't wait for an opportunity. They manufacture one. Charlotte looked at the survey report. Then she looked up. "You said you spent 8 years with the Denver and Pacific." "Yes." "Ma'am, why did you leave?" He was quiet. Not the deliberate quiet of a man choosing his words, the different quiet of a man deciding whether to open a door he had kept closed for a long time. "I found something," he said finally. "Not silver copper. Up near Laramie. Worth considerably more than the company had assumed that land was worth." He paused. "I reported it accurately, the way you're supposed to." And 3 weeks later, a man named Hargrove Denver and Pacific's chief land officer filed paperwork that transferred the rights to a company he owned privately. And I was informed that my services were no longer required. Charlotte looked at him. "He stole it. He used the legal mechanisms available to him," Caleb said. And the careful flatness of his voice told her more than any anger would have. "Which is a different thing from stealing in the way the law sees it, and the same thing from stealing in the way I see it. And you came up here. I came up here." He turned the cold cup in his hands. "I wanted to do work I could stand behind. I do small surveys now. Private clients. People who need to know what their land is worth before someone else tells them it's worth nothing. Like my father. Like your father." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Outside, the mountains were doing what mountains do at night, holding the dark, staying immovable, being exactly what they were. She had grown up in a house surrounded by those mountains and had never given much thought to what it might mean to be a person who chose them over everything else. "He trusted you," she said. "My father, he wasn't an easy man to earn that from." Caleb looked at her steadily. "He was a man who paid attention," he said. "He watched how I handled the work. He asked questions that told me what he was actually thinking, rather than what he wanted me to think he was thinking." A brief pause. "He reminded me of someone." "Who?" He looked at her. He didn't answer immediately. And then he said, "You'll figure that out." It wasn't evasion. It was something else, an observation that he was making and not explaining. Which was, she was beginning to understand, one of the ways Caleb Whitmore communicated. He said things and left space for them to land. She filed it away and looked back at the maps. "We need to file a formal claim," she said, "before Caldwell does anything else." "Yep." "Ma'am, that's the first thing. The Territorial Land Office."
"Won't help you."
"The man who runs the Territorial Office up here is a man named Stoddard. He and Caldwell have an understanding." He said it without inflection. "We need to go to the Federal Claim Office in Cheyenne. File under the Mining Act. It takes the claim out of Stoddard's hands entirely. How long does that take?" 6 days ride to Cheyenne and back. 2 days to file and have it processed." He looked at her. 8 days total if nothing goes wrong. Charlotte calculated. "Caldwell doesn't know yet that the debt is settled. He'll figure it out tomorrow when the auction doesn't proceed." "That gives us," Caleb said, "maybe less. He has a rider who makes the circuit between here and Cheyenne. If Caldwell wires ahead, then we need to leave tomorrow," Charlotte said. "Not in 8 days. Tomorrow. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it. And she understood that he had expected her to argue for staying. For more time, for the comfort of familiar ground. She had spent 6 weeks on familiar ground, and it had gotten her precisely nowhere. Tomorrow, he agreed. She slept in the second room, which was small and simply furnished and smelled of pine and old paper. And she slept better than she had in 6 weeks, which told her something she wasn't entirely sure how to interpret. In the morning she found coffee already made, and Caleb outside working on the horse's gear with the focused attention of a man who prepares carefully for things that matter. He had packed provisions. He had the survey documents in a waterproof case that he strapped to the back of the gray horse, with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. "I need to ask you something," Charlotte said. He looked up. "When this is over, when the claim is filed, and whatever happens with Caldwell happens, what do you want from this?" He straightened up. He looked at her with that direct, assessing look that she had noticed yesterday. "Nothing you haven't agreed to give me, that's not an answer." "No," he said. "It's the only honest answer I have right now." He picked up his hat from the fence post. "I gave your father my word. I'm here to keep it. What comes after that is a different conversation." It was the most words he had said in one stretch since she'd met him. She thought about pressing further and decided against it. Not because she was afraid of the answer, but because she understood. Suddenly, that he meant exactly what he said, that the after was genuinely a different conversation. One he wasn't willing to have prematurely, and that this quality in him was not evasion but a kind of integrity she hadn't encountered in exactly this form before. They rode south before turning east on the lower pass, staying off the main road at Caleb's direction. Charlotte didn't question it. She had learned enough in the past 18 hours to trust his read of the terrain. And he had explained simply that Caldwell's men patrolled the main road east specifically because it was the route to Cheyenne and the federal offices. By mid-morning they had covered 12 miles. The day was building toward the particular ferocity of Wyoming summer heat. Dry and absolute, and Charlotte rode without complaint because she had been riding since she was 8, and because complaining was not something she did. It was around the second hour that she noticed Caleb had slowed his horse. "What is it?" she asked. He was looking at a ridgeline above and to the north. His expression was neutral, but she had already begun to read the small things, the specific stillness in his shoulders that meant he was paying attention to something he hadn't decided was a threat yet. "Rider on the ridge," he said. Sitting still. She looked. She couldn't see anything. "Are you certain?" The horse moved a minute ago. He kept his own horse at the slower pace. "Could be anyone. Could be a rancher checking fence line. But the ridge line above that particular spot is the best view of this trail for 3 miles in each direction." He glanced at her. "It's where I'd put a man if I wanted to know who was riding east." Charlotte absorbed this. Caldwell already knows. Possibly he didn't speed up, which she realized was deliberate. A man who changed his pace when watched gave information to the watcher. Or possibly that's Dave Greer, who runs sheep up on the north pasture and has no opinions about either of us. And if it isn't Dave Greer, then we're going to need to change our route. He kept his eyes forward. "There's a southern pass, longer by about 4 hours. Less visible. If we take the southern pass, how long to Cheyenne? 9 days total. That's too long." "Yes, ma'am." "Then we keep going on this road." He looked at her. "There may be consequences to that." "There are consequences to every choice," she said. "The consequences to arriving in Cheyenne after Caldwell has filed something in our way are worse." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the road and let his horse find its own pace. "Your father said you didn't argue without good reason. My father said a lot of things to you." Apparently, he did. Something shifted briefly in his expression, something that wasn't quite a smile but was in that direction. "He was proud of you." Charlotte felt that land somewhere in her chest and settle there. She didn't respond immediately, because some things didn't need a response so much as they needed a moment of being received. And she received it. And then she straightened in the saddle and looked at the road ahead. They were 2 miles past the point where the possible watcher on the ridgeline would have lost sight of them when Caleb said, very quietly, "Don't look back." Charlotte did not look back. "How many?" "2, coming off the ridge on the eastern cut." "They're making up ground." He rode easy, nothing in his posture suggesting urgency. "They don't want to run us down in the open. Too many questions. They'll try to get ahead and make it look like a chance meeting. And if we run, then it's not a chance meeting and everyone knows it." He reached inside his jacket for a brief moment, and then his hand came out empty. But she understood the gesture. "There's a relay station 4 miles ahead. Joe Briggs runs it. He knew your father. Will that matter? To Caldwell's men?" "No. To Joe Briggs?" "Might matter to Joe." 4 miles, Charlotte said. 20 minutes at this pace. She nodded once. She kept her eyes forward and her hands steady on the reins, and she breathed slowly and thought about her father sitting in his chair in the evenings reading aloud. And she thought about the letter in her pocket, and she decided that none of this was going to end on a back trail in Wyoming, because a man who had stolen her family's future sent riders after her. The relay station appeared at the base of a long slope, a solid building with a corral and a water trough and a man standing outside it who shaded his eyes against the sun when he heard horses. Joe Briggs was 55, broad, and had the look of a man who had been many things in his life and had settled on being useful as the one that stuck. He recognized Caleb first. Then he looked at Charlotte and something moved across his face, a shifting. A recognition, the expression of a man recalling a name connected to a face. "You're Bill Bennett's daughter," he said. "Yes," Charlotte said. "God rest him." He said it simply, without performance. "What do you need?" "2 of Caldwell's men are behind us," Caleb said. He had already dismounted. 4, maybe 5 minutes back. Joe Briggs looked at the road behind them. "What are you carrying that he wants?" "Evidence," Charlotte said. "Enough to prove that the debt on our land was manufactured." Joe Briggs was quiet for about 4 seconds. Then he said, "Get your horses in the barn." The 2 riders arrived 7 minutes later. Charlotte watched through the barn's side window. Joe had positioned her there without being asked. The instinct of a man who understood how things worked. The 2 men were young, professional in the specific way of men who are paid to be intimidating and know how to wear it. They questioned Joe Briggs briefly. Joe Briggs was a man who lied with the complete who considered himself humble to be telling a different kind of truth. He said he'd seen a man and a woman on the road an hour ago, heading southeast, which was neither direction either of them had been going. The riders moved on. Charlotte waited until Caleb came to the barn door. "He lied for us," she said. "He lied for your father," Caleb said. "There's a difference." She thought about that. About how many years her father had spent building something that looked, from the outside, like just a life, a ranch, a community, a name, but was actually a network of people who had received from William Bennett some specific quality of being seen and valued, and who had not forgotten it. "He built all of this," she said. Quietly, "Yes," Caleb said. "He did." She pressed her hand against her pocket where the letter was. "I keep thinking I should have known more about him." "Children don't know their parents," Caleb said. Not unkindly, not fully. They know the version that was trying to protect them. Charlotte looked at him. There was something in the way he said it, a specific, particular knowledge, the knowledge of someone who was not speaking theoretically. "You lost someone," she said. He looked at her. "Your family," she said. "You mentioned it once. In passing. You said you'd moved up here after." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "My wife, son. Fever 3 years ago. The winter kind." He said it quietly, without the particular weight people put on grief when they're performing it rather than carrying it. "I came up here because I didn't know what else to do with myself. And then I found I could do good work up here, so I stayed." Charlotte felt the full weight of what he had just handed her, the bear. Plain fact of it, offered without drama, which somehow made it heavier than drama would have. She thought about him on that mountain for 3 years. She thought about her father going up there to hire a man for a survey and finding instead someone who understood loss the way you understand weather as something that shapes the landscape you live in. "I'm sorry," she said. "Yes," he said. "So am I." They rode the rest of that day in silence that had changed in quality. There are silences between strangers, and silences between people who have told each other the things that cost something. And the latter has a texture to it, a substance, like the difference between empty air and air before rain. When they stopped for the night, Caleb built a fire, and she went through more of the documents by firelight. He sat on the other side of the fire and cleaned his rifle with the focused, methodical attention he gave everything practical. And she watched him from the edge of her vision and thought about a man who had kept a promise to a dead man, out of something as simple and demanding as the belief that keeping one's word was what separated a person from the worst of what people could be. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He looked up. "The day at the auction, you rode in from the mountain. You had to have left early, very early to be there, when the auction was supposed to start." She looked at him across the fire. "How long had you known it was happening?" 3 days, he said. "You knew 3 days before the auction, and you waited until the last possible hour." "Yes." "Ma'am, why?" He held the rifle across his knees and looked at her steadily. "Because I needed to know if anyone in that town was going to stand up first. I needed to know if you had people." Something cool moved through her. And you didn't. He said it simply, without apology for what it revealed about the town or about her. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. You went up there alone and asked Caldwell for the documentation, and the whole town watched like it was a show they hadn't before. He set the rifle aside. "After that, I knew what kind of thing this was." "What kind of thing is it?" "The kind where one person decides what's true and everyone else decides that person is right because it's easier than deciding otherwise." He looked at the fire. "I've seen it before. The details change. The shape is always the same." "You let me stand there alone for a minute," Charlotte said. "You could have come forward sooner." "Yes," he said. "Why didn't you?" He looked at her then directly. The way he looked when he was saying something he had thought through fully. "Because you needed to speak first, not me. If I'd come in and paid the debt before you said anything." Everyone in that crowd would have remembered a man coming to a woman's rescue. He paused. Instead, they remember a woman standing up to Richard Caldwell in front of the whole town, and then a man coming to back her up. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment. "That's a very particular way to think about something," she said finally. "I've had time to think," he said. Up on the mountain, the fire snapped between them. An owl called somewhere above them in the dark and then went silent. Charlotte looked at the papers in her hands, and then looked at the fire, and thought about a man who had planned not just the act but the story of the act, who had understood that the way a thing was done was as important as the doing of it. "My father trusted you," she said again. It meant something different when she said it now than when she had said it the first time. "I know," Caleb said, and then quietly, "I'm trying not to let that be a reason you feel you have to." She looked at him. "Your trust," he said, "should be yours to give or not give. Not an inheritance." Charlotte set down the papers. The fire was lower now. The mountains all around them were doing what they did, being permanent. Being indifferent, being the kind of backdrop against which small human things became either irrelevant or strangely clarified. "I trust you," she said, "not because of my father." He looked at her. "Because of everything since yesterday," she said. "The word yet. Joe Briggs in the barn, the way you let me speak first." She met his eyes. "And because you told me about your wife and son without making it something I owed you for." He was very still. He started, and then he stopped, and she understood that this was one of the things that cost him. That being received cost him, because he had been up on a mountain for 3 years, with nobody to receive anything from him, and he had made his peace with that, and she was taking it apart. "You don't have to say anything," she said. He nodded. He looked at the fire. After a moment he said, "We should sleep." "Early start tomorrow." "Yes," she said. She lay in her bedroll and looked at the stars and thought about the shape of what was happening, not the legal situation. Not Caldwell, not Cheyenne and the federal office, but the thing underneath all of that. The way two people who had each lost everything essential could sit across a fire and hand each other back something neither of them had expected to find. She reached into her pocket and took out her father's letter and read it one more time in the dark. By feel more than by sight. Trust him, she put it back. She slept. The third day on the road was harder. The terrain shifted eastward. And the heat was different here, less the clean, dry heat of altitude and more the pressing, relentless heat of the lower plains. Charlotte rode without complaint. Caleb was already learning, she could see him learning it, that she did not need to be asked if she was all right. She would say something when she needed something. Her silence was not distress, it was just silence. Around midday they reached a small settlement, 6 buildings. A well, a man and a woman outside the general store who watched them ride past with expressions that were cautious rather than hostile. Caleb pulled up at the store. "We need water and provisions," he said. "And I want to hear if there's been any traffic on this road." The man outside the general store was named Porter, which was what it said above the door, and he had the particular quality of a frontier merchant willing to talk to anyone, commit to no one. He sold them water and hardtack and dried beef, and he watched Charlotte with the expression men wore when they were trying to figure out what category to put her in. "You heading to Cheyenne?" Porter asked. "Passing through," Caleb said. Which was not technically a lie. "Had 4 men come through yesterday," Porter said. Watching the road. "Coming from the west." He paused. They were asking about 2 riders. Charlotte felt Caleb go still beside her. "What did you tell them?" Caleb asked. Porter looked at him. "I told them I hadn't seen anyone interesting." He paused. "My wife's family lost their land to Canyon Trust 3 years back. I don't have a lot of patience for the men Canyon Trust sends down the road." Caleb held the man's gaze. "Thank you." 4 men, Charlotte said when they were mounted again and moving. "Not 2. He's escalating," Caleb said. "We're still 2 days from Cheyenne." "Yes, and 4 men ahead of us means he may have wired someone in Cheyenne already." Her voice was level. She was doing arithmetic again. "Can he stop the filing at the federal office?" "Not legally," Caleb said. "But he doesn't need to stop it legally. He just needs to delay it. If he has someone at the office who creates a problem, missing paperwork, wrong form, incorrect filing procedure, it buys him time to take other action." "What other action?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "The kind that doesn't leave a paper trail." Charlotte absorbed this. She thought about the canvas bag of gold on the auction podium. She thought about a man who had spent 20 years making sure that losing was something that happened to other people. She thought about her father, who had known all of this and had borrowed money he didn't need and gotten sick and died anyway. "I'm not going to let him have it," she said. "No," Caleb said. "I need you to understand that. Whatever happens between here and Cheyenne, whatever he sends down that road, I am not going to stop." Caleb looked at her. And she could see it happening in his face, that shifting, that recalibration, a man who had come down from the mountain to keep a promise and was discovering that the person he had come down for was something different and more demanding than a promise had prepared him for. "Your father said you were stubborn," he said. "My father was right. He said it like it was a good thing." "It is a good thing," Charlotte said. "In the right direction." She rode ahead slightly, which was not something she planned, but was something her horse did in response to the change in her posture. And Caleb watched her go for a moment, this woman who had lost everything 3 weeks ago and was riding toward it anyway, and then urged his horse to catch up. The 4th morning, before light, Charlotte woke to the sound of Caleb's voice outside. Low, careful, not alarmed but not relaxed either. She was on her feet and at the door of the relay station shelter, where they'd spent the night before she was fully awake. He was talking to a rider, 18 or 19, on a horse that had been ridden hard. The rider was handing him something, a folded paper, passed over with the expression of someone delivering a message they weren't supposed to know the contents of. Charlotte came outside. The writer looked at her, looked at Caleb, and rode away without another word. "What is it?" she asked. Caleb unfolded the paper. He read it. His expression did not change substantially, which had stopped being reassuring and had started being informative. Because she had learned that the things that made Caleb Whitmore's expression change were smaller things, small kindnesses, small moments of connection, the large things he processed somewhere internal, without showing the working. "It's from August Pitts," he said. August Pitts, the county recorder who had counted the gold. "He says Caldwell has filed a complaint with the territorial court, claiming the settlement payment was fraudulent." Charlotte stared at him. "On what grounds?" "He's claiming the gold was stolen property. That I used funds obtained illegally to settle the debt, which would invalidate the settlement." He folded the paper again. "It's not going to hold. There's no basis for it. But it gives him a mechanism to freeze the property status until the complaint is resolved." "Which could months," Charlotte said. "Months. During which time he can continue to pursue the claim through other channels." He looked at her. "We need to move faster." "How August Pitts is telling us something," he said. He held up the paper. "He sent this. He didn't have to. He's the county recorder. He works inside the system Caldwell controls. But he sent this." He paused. "There are people who are tired of Caldwell. People who have been waiting for something to be different." He looked at Charlotte. "Your father knew all of them." The shape of it opened up in front of Charlotte like a map she hadn't known she was reading. All those years, all those quiet relationships her father had built Joe Briggs. August Pitts, the unnamed others, a man who had known, perhaps for longer than she understood, that someday it was going to come to this. That someday the thing he had found on the northeast quarter was going to bring Caldwell to his door, and he was going to need people he trusted. He had spent years building that network, and then he had died. And he had left her Caleb. He was preparing for this, she said. Yes, Caleb said. He knew he wasn't going to be the one to finish it. Caleb was quiet. So he built everything he could, she said, and then he gave me everything he couldn't finish building. She looked at the folded paper in Caleb's hand. Including you. The word sat between them in the early morning air. Caleb looked at her with the specific directness that was his most honest expression. I'm not something he gave you, he said carefully. No, she said, that's not what I meant. She met his eyes. He gave me access to you. The choice of what to do with that was always mine. He held her gaze. Something settled in him, she could see it, the way tension settles when it resolves into something simpler and more certain. We need to ride, he said. Yes, she said. They broke camp in 20 minutes. They rode east into a morning that was already hot. Already bright, already pressing toward the kind of day that tested people, not through dramatic crisis, but through the relentless accumulation of endurance, required the kind of day that showed you what you were made of, simply by being long. And Charlotte Bennett, who had spent 6 weeks losing everything, rode toward Cheyenne like a woman who had figured out that loss was not the end of anything. It was just the place where things began to get interesting. They reached Cheyenne on the 5th day, not the 6th. The 5th, because Caleb pushed the pace after August Pitts's warning, and Charlotte matched him without complaint. And because the southern detour they'd taken after Porter's store had added miles, but removed the 4 men Caldwell had sent ahead of them. They arrived dusty and tired and smelling of 5 days on the road. And Cheyenne received them the way a federal city receives everyone, without particular interest, and without obstruction, which was exactly what they needed. The Federal Land and Mining Claims Office was on Cary Avenue. A solid brick building that looked like it had been built by people who intended the federal government to be taken seriously. Caleb tied both horses at the post outside, and Charlotte straightened her coat, and they walked in together. The clerk behind the counter was a young man named Ellis, who had the careful, slightly defensive efficiency of someone who processed important documents all day, and had learned that everyone who walked through that door believed their claim was the most urgent one in the territory. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Charlotte. He looked at the waterproof document case Caleb set on the counter. Mining claim filing, Caleb said. Bennett Holdings. Red Canyon Township, Northeast Quarter Section, Albany County. Ellis reached under the counter for a form. Survey doc complete, Caleb said. Professional survey. Dated, signed, cross-referenced against the territorial plat maps. He opened the case and laid the documents on the counter with the precise, unhurried movement of a man who has prepared for this moment and is not going to be rushed through it. Ellis began going through the papers. Charlotte watched him. She was watching for the specific thing, the hesitation, the flicker of recognition, the moment when a man who had been told something in advance in the papers he'd been warned about. She had been watching for it since they walked in. Ellis did not hesitate. He went through the documents with professional thoroughness, asked 2 clarifying questions about the survey methodology, and reached for his stamp. Filing fee is $12, he said. Caleb paid it. Ellis stamped 3 copies. He handed one to Charlotte, one to Caleb, kept one for the federal record. Processing takes 48 hours for preliminary confirmation. You'll receive written certification within 30 days by post. We need a certified copy today, Charlotte said. Given that there's an active complaint filed in the Albany County Territorial Court against the property, we need documentation that the federal claim predates any territorial action. Ellis looked at her. That's an unusual request. It's an unusual situation, she said. The complaint was filed by Richard Caldwell of Red Canyon. I imagine you have some familiarity with that name. Something moved behind Ellis's eyes. Not guilt, more like the specific wariness of a man who had heard a name he associated with complications. I can have a certified copy prepared by end of business today, he said. 4 o'clock. Thank you, Charlotte said. They stepped outside into the Cheyenne afternoon, and Charlotte let out a breath that she hadn't been fully aware she was holding. He knew the name, she said. Yes, Caleb said. Caldwell has reach here. He has reach everywhere. Caleb looked down Cary Avenue. But the federal office isn't the territorial office. Ellis works for Washington, not for Wyoming. That matters. 4 o'clock, Charlotte said. That gives us 5 hours. Then we eat something, Caleb said. And we talk about what comes next. They found a dining room 2 blocks from the land office, clean, unremarkable, the kind of place that served food without ceremony and didn't encourage lingering. Caleb ordered without looking at the menu, which told Charlotte he had been to Cheyenne before. She ordered coffee and whatever was hot, and when it came she ate with the focused efficiency of someone refueling rather than enjoying a meal. The federal claim establishes our priority, she said. Caldwell's territorial complaint can't supersede a federal filing. Correct. But he can still tie up the practical use of the land in territorial court for months. Even with the federal claim filed, if the territorial judge issues an injunction, Judge Webb, Caleb said. Who plays cards with Caldwell on Fridays? Yes. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. We need something that removes Caldwell's ability to use the territorial courts. Something that makes his complaint not just legally weak, but actively dangerous for him to pursue. Caleb looked at her across the table. You're thinking about the note. I'm thinking about the interest rate on the note, she said. What he charged my father wasn't just aggressive, it was usurious under territorial banking statutes. The rate is printed right there in the documentation. If we file a counter-complaint with the Territorial Banking Commission, Caldwell has people on the Banking Commission. He has one person, she said. A man named Forsyth. I wrote to the Banking Commission 6 weeks ago and got back a letter signed by Forsyth declining to review the matter. She looked at him. But the Banking Commission has 3 members. The other 2 are Fletcher and Dunmore. I don't know them. Caleb was quiet for a moment. I know Dunmore, he said. Charlotte looked at him. He was with the Denver and Pacific, Caleb said. He left about a year after I did. Different reasons, he paused. He knows what Caldwell is. Would he hear us? Caleb turned his coffee cup in his hands. I haven't spoken to the man in 7 years. Would he hear us? She asked again. He looked at her. I don't know. But I know where he lives. She set down her cup. Then that's where we go after 4 o'clock. The certified copy from Ellis came at 10 minutes to 4. Charlotte held it in both hands for a moment. This piece of paper. This official, stamped, certified piece of paper that said in the flat language of federal bureaucracy what her father had known and died knowing and had spent his last months trying to protect. She folded it carefully and put it in the inner pocket of her coat, next to the letter. Caleb was watching her. "You all right? I will be," she said. "When this is finished." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. He was standing in the afternoon light outside the federal building. Hat in hand, watching her with the expression she had come to understand, was his version of concern, not anxious. Not performative, just present and paying attention. "No," she said honestly. "Not entirely. But I don't need to be all right to keep going." "I know that," he said. "I just wanted you to know I was asking." She held his gaze for a moment. In the 4 days of writing, in the camp conversations and the silences and the slow accumulation of understanding that had grown between them, like something that had needed only time and proximity and honesty, she had come to recognize that Caleb Whitmore showed care in specific, deliberate ways, not frequently, not dramatically, but with the particular precision of a man who did not spend words or gestures he didn't mean. "Thank you," she said. She meant it plainly, without embellishment. He put his hat on. Dunmore lives on the north edge of town. 20-minute walk. Thomas Dunmore's house was a modest frame building on a quiet street. And Dunmore himself answered the door in his shirt sleeves with the expression of a man interrupted in the middle of something that required concentration. He was 60, gray-haired, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent years assessing things and had long since given up pretending he didn't form opinions quickly. He looked at Caleb. His expression did the specific thing that faces do when they encounter someone unexpectedly from a chapter of life they had considered closed. "Whitmore, he's Mr. Dunmore," Caleb said. "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important." Dunmore looked at Charlotte. Then he looked back at Caleb. Then he stepped back from the door. They sat in his front room and Charlotte laid the documentation on his table, the survey report. The original note with the usurious interest rate. The federal claim filing, August Pitts's warning letter. Her own correspondence with the banking commission, and the letter from Forsyth declining review. She laid it out in order and let him read it without interrupting, which took 15 minutes, during which Caleb sat beside her and the room was very quiet. When Dunmore finished, he put the papers down, looked at the table for a long moment. "Forsyth," he said. "Yes," Charlotte said. "He's had an arrangement with Caldwell for at least 4 years," Dunmore said. He said it with the resigned flatness of a man stating something he had known and been unable to act on. "2 complaints before yours. Both declined. I've been outvoted twice. You can't be outvoted if the complaint comes with federal documentation," Charlotte said. "The federal claim creates a jurisdictional question the commission can't ignore. And the interest rate on this note," she pointed to the specific column, "is 12 points above the legal maximum under the 1882 Banking Regulation Act. That's not a gray area. That's a clear violation." Dunmore looked at her. He had the expression of a man revising an assumption he hadn't known he was making. "You know the statutes. My father taught me to read everything," she said, "including the boring parts." A brief moment passed in which something in Dunmore shifted some internal resistance. Some habitual caution developed over years of being outvoted and outlasted by men like Caldwell. Charlotte watched it happen and said nothing, because she had learned in the past 5 days that there were moments when the most powerful thing you could do was simply wait and let a person arrive at their own decision. "I'll convene an emergency session," Dunmore said. Under Section 14 of the Commission Charter, a commission member can request an emergency review when there's documented evidence of a statutory violation in a pending legal action. He looked at Caleb. "You'll testify about the survey findings?" "Yes," Caleb said. "And you?" He looked at Charlotte. "Can you speak to the financial records?" Your father's accounts? I kept his accounts for 10 years, she said. I can speak to every transaction. Dunmore picked up the note with the interest rate. He looked at it one more time. Caldwell is going to know within 24 hours that this commission session is happening, he said. He'll apply pressure. He'll apply pressure regardless, Charlotte said. The question is whether the pressure can change what's in these documents. And it can't. Dunmore looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. Your father came to see me once. About 2 years ago. He didn't tell me everything. But he told me enough that I understood something was coming. He paused. He said if a young woman came to me with a stack of papers and more backbone than sense, I should listen to her. Charlotte felt something break open quietly in her chest. She kept her expression steady. He had a lot of faith in paper trails, she said. Apparently he had faith in you, Dunmore said. The emergency commission session was set for the following morning. They went back to the boarding house where they'd taken rooms, separate rooms, on separate floors, arranged by Caleb with the matter-of-fact practicality of a man who understood that Charlotte's reputation was a practical asset they couldn't afford to compromise, and Charlotte sat on the edge of her bed and read through everything one more time. She read until the lamp oil ran low. Then she lay down in her clothes and looked at the ceiling, and thought about her father walking into Thomas Dunmore's house 2 years ago. Knowing what was coming, laying the groundwork for a fight he might not live to finish. He had prepared everything except his own survival. She pressed her hand flat against her chest, where the letter and the federal filing rested in her inner pocket. 2 pieces of paper, her father's last words and the legal instrument that made those words mean something. She slept for 4 hours. She woke before the alarm she'd set and dressed, and went downstairs and found Caleb already in the dining room with coffee, going through his own copy of the survey documentation with a pencil, marking the specific figures he intended to cite in testimony. He looked up when she sat down. Sleep some, she said. He pushed a cup toward her. There's something I need to tell you before we go in. She looked at him. I told you I found the deposit and reported it to your father. That's true. He set down the pencil. What I didn't tell you is that I also found evidence that Caldwell's original survey, the one done before mine, was filed with the territorial office, with the deposit information removed. Charlotte stared at him. He falsified the survey. His surveyor falsified it. On Caldwell's instruction, I have to believe, though proving instruction is harder than proving the falsification itself. He held her gaze. I have the original territorial filing, and I have my own survey showing what should have been in it. The discrepancy is not subtle. Why didn't you tell me this at the start? Because at the start I didn't know if you were in a position to use it safely, he said. If I'd handed you that information in Red Canyon, before you had federal protection on the claim, and before we were in front of a commission that could act on it, Caldwell would have moved to take it from you. She absorbed this. You were protecting the evidence. I was protecting you, he said. The evidence is just paper. You're the one who can use it. Charlotte looked at him across the table. She thought about trust, about her father's letter, about the word yet, about Joe Briggs in the barn and August Pitts in the night, and Thomas Dunmore opening his door. About a man who had planned not just the act but the story of the act, and who was now telling her that his planning had extended further and deeper than she'd known. Is there anything else, she said, not with accusation, with the level tone of someone who needed the complete inventory. He held her gaze. No, he said, that's everything. All right, she said. She picked up her coffee. She looked at the survey documents he'd been marking. Show me what you're citing. He turned the papers toward her, and they worked through it together. And when it was time to go, they went side by side out into the Cheyenne morning and walked to the banking commission offices and walked in. The session lasted 3 hours. Dunmore ran it with the specific, controlled efficiency of a man who had waited years for the procedural opening to do what he was doing. Forsyth objected 4 times. Dunmore overruled him each time on documented procedural grounds. Because Dunmore had spent the night preparing for every objection Forsyth was likely to make and had the charter language ready each time. Caleb testified about the survey. He was precise, specific, and completely implacable, a man who had spent 15 years doing this work and knew that what he was saying was accurate and was not going to be moved by pressure or repetition or the specific contempt that Forsyth directed at him. When Forsyth questioned his credentials, Caleb laid out his 8 years with the Denver and Pacific and the specific certifications he held. When Forsyth questioned his methodology, Caleb walked through it step by step in language that assumed a technically literate audience, which forced Forsyth either to reveal his own ignorance or stop pressing. Forsyth stopped pressing. Charlotte testified about the financial records. She had 10 years of her father's accounts memorized, not impressionistically but precisely. The way a person memorizes something they have handled every day for years. She walked the commission through the timeline of the debt, the structure of the note, the interest calculations, and the gap between what the note required and what territorial banking law allowed. She cited the specific statutory section 3 times. She did not look at Forsyth. She looked at Fletcher, the third commission member, a quiet man who hadn't spoken yet and who she had decided. Watching him through the testimony was a man who needed things laid out clearly before he would commit. She laid everything out clearly. When she finished, Fletcher asked one question. "Miss Bennett, are you asserting that the debt that precipitated the foreclosure action was structured illegally from inception?" "Yes," she said. "I am asserting that, and the documents support it." Fletcher wrote something on his notepad. He did not look at Forsyth. The commission recessed for 30 minutes. When they reconvened, Dunmore announced that the commission had found, by a vote of 2-1, that the note held by Canyon Trust and lending against the Bennett property violated Section 7 of the 1882 Banking Regulation Act, that all interest charges above the legal rate were void, that the adjusted debt had been legally satisfied by the third-party payment made by Caleb Whitmore at the auction, and that the foreclosure proceeding and any legal action derivative of it had no valid foundation. He also announced that the commission was referring the matter of the falsified survey to the Territorial Attorney General's office and requesting a federal review of Canyon Trust and Lending's lending practices. Forsyth walked out without speaking. Charlotte sat very still for a moment after the session closed. The certified commission ruling was in her hand. It had taken less than an hour to produce. Dunmore had brought his clerk, who had the form ready, which told Charlotte that Dunmore had expected this outcome and had prepared for it. That somewhere in the night he had decided fully to do this thing. Caleb was beside her. She was aware of his shoulder an inch from hers. The closest they had been physically in 5 days on the road. And she was aware of it in the specific way of a person who has spent 5 days being aware of someone, and has decided not to examine that awareness too closely while there were more urgent things to attend to. There were no longer more urgent things to attend to. The ruling was in her hand. "It's done," she said. "The first part," he said quietly. "Caldwell is going to respond, I know." She looked at the ruling. "But he's going to respond to a federal mining claim, a banking commission ruling, and a referral to the Attorney General. He has less room now." "Men like him don't recognize less room," Caleb said. "They recognize no room, and we haven't gotten him to no room yet." She looked at him. "Then we go back to Red Canyon." "Yes, and we let him respond." "Yes, and we're ready when he does." He looked at her steadily. "Are you ready?" Charlotte thought about the 6 weeks of letters and rejections, and people crossing the street to avoid her. She thought about standing alone at the auction podium, with her hand out for documentation that Caldwell was never going to let her examine. She thought about her father's handwriting on the bottom of that letter, the specific shape of the letters he had written since she was small. "Fight for it." "I've been ready since the morning of the auction," she said. They rode back toward Red Canyon the next morning with the certified commission ruling and the federal claim documentation and the falsified survey discrepancy report in the waterproof case on Caleb's horse. And Charlotte rode differently on the return journey, not more relaxed. Exactly. But more settled, the way a person rides when they know where they're going and why and have stopped spending energy on the question of whether the trip is worth making. On the first night back on the road, she asked him something she had been carrying for 2 days. In the commission session, she said, when Forsyth was questioning your methodology. You knew every objection he was going to make before he made it. Yes, Caleb said. Because you've faced those objections before. Because I spent an evening thinking through every weak point in the evidence and building the answer before someone else found the question. He looked at her across the fire. It's what I did at the Denver and Pacific, before Hargrove. I used to prepare cases for disputed claims, walk through every counter-argument, find the technical ground that couldn't be moved. You were good at it, she said. I was, he said simply. Not with pride, with the plain acknowledgement of a man stating a fact about himself. And then Hargrove used those skills against you. He used the system I worked in against me, Caleb said. Not my skills specifically. The skills were mine. He was quiet for a moment. I was angry about it for a long time. Angry enough that I stopped using them. Went up the mountain and did survey work and didn't build pieces. He paused. Your father was the first person in 6 years who asked me to think like that again. Charlotte looked at him. He knew what he was asking. I believe he did. He knew you had more left in you than survey maps. Caleb looked at the fire. He told me once that there's a particular kind of waste that happens when a good man decides the world doesn't deserve his best work. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. He said it like he was talking generally. He was looking right at me. Charlotte smiled. And it was the first time she had smiled fully in so many days that it felt like something she had misplaced and then found in an unexpected pocket. That sounds exactly like him. He was not a subtle man, Caleb agreed. He was completely subtle, she said. He just pretended not to be so people would underestimate him. Caleb looked at her. And then he did something she hadn't seen him do. He laughed. Not a large laugh, not a performed one, just a brief, genuine sound of recognition of a man realizing that he is understood in a way he hadn't expected. She felt it land somewhere in her chest and stay there. They rode into Albany County on the 3rd day of the return journey. And the land changed around them, back into something she knew, the particular quality of the light. The way the mountains sat behind the horizon at this specific angle. Home. Not a comfortable word given what waited there. But the right one. Caleb had been growing quieter through the day, which she recognized now as his version of preparing. He was watching the ridgelines, watching the road ahead, recalculating something she couldn't see but could feel in the changed quality of his attention. He'll know we went to Cheyenne, she said. He knew before we got there, Caleb said. He's had 2 weeks to prepare. What does prepared look like for a man like Caldwell? He was quiet for a moment. Legal pressure from every angle the commission ruling left open. Probably an attempt to discredit the survey, hire his own assessor. Produce contradicting documentation. He paused. Possibly something less formal, she said flatly. Men who have been doing this for 20 years and see it unraveling. He stopped. I don't want to alarm you unnecessarily. I'm not alarmed, she said. I'm calculating. There's a difference. She looked at him. You think he's dangerous in the immediate physical sense. I think he's a man who has always used the law as his primary instrument, Caleb said carefully. But the law is starting to work against him. When a man loses his primary instrument, he reaches for whatever is closest. Charlotte rode in silence for a minute. Your ranch, she said. You said so, yourself. The first night. He looked at her. We don't go to my house, she said. We go to yours. We have the high ground, literally. We have the documents in a secure location. And we make Caldwell come to us. On ground we know, rather than confronting him in town where he controls the social environment. Caleb studied her. You've been thinking about this. Since Cheyenne, she said. Since Dunmore said Caldwell would know within 24 hours. She held his gaze. I don't want to be defensive, but I want to choose where we stand. He nodded slowly. There are 2 men who work my operation part-time, he said. Hector and Daniel. Good men. I can send word ahead to have them at the ranch. Do that, she said. He looked at her for another moment. This particular look she had come to understand was not assessment, but something closer to appreciation. The look of a man encountering a quality he respects in someone he is already inclined to respect. Your father said you'd know what to do when it came to it, he said. My father had more confidence in me than the evidence supported, Charlotte said. No, Caleb said. He had exactly the right amount. They reached the outskirts of Red Canyon in the early evening, skirting the town itself and moving north on the back road toward the mountain. Caleb sent the message to Hector from the relay station Joe Briggs, who received it with a nod and asked no questions. They were 3 miles from the ranch when they saw the smoke. Charlotte saw Caleb's whole body change at the sight of it, a single, absolute stillness, the way a person goes still when something they feared is confirmed before they had time to fully fear it. The smoke was coming from the direction of his ranch. He spurred the gray horse forward before she had processed what she was seeing, and she pushed Clara after him, and they came over the last rise and stopped. The outbuilding was burning. Not the main structure, the outbuilding where he stored his equipment and the secondary survey documents and 6 years of accumulated professional work. Hector was in the yard. He was bleeding from a cut above his ear, and he was standing very straight in the way men stand when they are injured and do not intend to show it. Caleb was off his horse and at the man's side before Charlotte had fully stopped. How many? Caleb said. 4, Hector said. They came an hour ago. Said they had a court order to seize survey documents relevant to a legal proceeding. His jaw was set hard. I told them you weren't here. They went in anyway. The case, Caleb said. He was already moving toward the main house. I got it, Hector said. Soon as I saw them coming up the road. Put it in the root cellar under the kitchen floor. He looked at Charlotte. Your papers, ma'am. I didn't know what was in the case, but I figured if they wanted inside the ranch. The case was what they were after. Charlotte dismounted and looked at this man, a ranch hand she had never met 4 days ago. Bleeding from his ear, standing straight in his yard with someone else's enemy, having just ridden through it and felt something that sat between gratitude and rage in proportions she wasn't going to sort out right now. Thank you, she said. Hector nodded once. Daniel went for the sheriff. Caleb had come back from the main house. They took whatever equipment was in the outbuilding, he said. His voice was controlled. Survey tools. 2 years of field notes. Charlotte looked at him. But not the case. Not the case, he said. Then they have nothing, she said. Tools and field notes from old surveys aren't the Bennett claim. They can't use equipment to change what's in a federal filing. They know that, Caleb said. He was looking at the burning outbuilding with the particular expression of a man watching years of work become smoke and choosing how to carry that. This isn't about the evidence. This is a message. What message? He turned to look at her. His eyes were very clear and very steady, and she could see in them the specific thing she had first noticed at the auction, that quality of absolute decision. Of a man who has looked at what is in front of him and chosen not to flinch from it. That he's not going to stop, Caleb said. That a federal filing and a commission ruling are not going to stop him. That he's willing to cross lines he hasn't crossed before. He paused. And that he's afraid. Charlotte looked at the fire. She thought about her father's papers in the root cellar, under the kitchen floor. She thought about the certified commission ruling in her inner pocket. Pressed against her heart, the same way her father's letter was pressed against her heart. She thought about 20 years of Richard Caldwell, deciding what was true, and who could afford to tell him otherwise. Good, she said. Caleb looked at her. Afraid men make mistakes, she said. And we're going to be here when he makes his. The sheriff arrived an hour after Daniel sent for him. His name was Burl Tanner, and he had been sheriff of Albany County for 11 years, which was long enough to know exactly how things worked in Red Canyon, and short enough that he still had moments, rare ones, when that knowledge made him uncomfortable. He was a big man going soft around the middle, with a deputy beside him who looked young enough that the badge on his chest still seemed to surprise him occasionally. Tanner looked at the burning outbuilding. He looked at Hector's split ear. He looked at Caleb and then at Charlotte, and he arranged his face into the expression of a man doing a careful calculation before he committed to anything. "Caleb," he said. "Burl," Caleb said. "Heard there was some trouble. 4 men rode onto my property with what they claimed was a court order and set fire to my outbuilding," Caleb said. His voice was the same flat, controlled register it had been since they'd crested the rise and seen the smoke. "My man Hector can describe them." Tanner looked at Hector. "You get a good look?" "Good enough," Hector said. "3 of them I've seen in town. They work for Caldwell. The 4th one I didn't recognize, older, dressed like a lawyer." Something shifted in Tanner's face. "A lawyer, had papers," Hector said. "Showed them to me before they went past. Said it was a court order authorizing seizure of survey documents in connection with a legal proceeding." "What court?" Charlotte said. Tanner looked at her. He was assessing her with the particular expression of a man deciding how seriously to take a woman who was speaking in a tone that assumed he would take her seriously. "What court issued the order?" she asked again. "I'd have to look into that." "Miss Bennett," she said. "Charlotte Bennett. And I'd like you to look into it now, Sheriff, because I have in my possession a federal mining claim filing and a banking commission ruling that were processed in Cheyenne 2 days ago, both of which are relevant to whatever order those men were carrying. A territorial court issuing a seizure order that conflicts with a federal proceeding is not a small matter." Tanner was quiet for a moment. He looked at federal filings. "We do," Caleb said. Another moment. Tanner had the look of a man standing on ground that had been solid an hour ago and was now doing something unexpected under his boots. "I'll need to see them." Charlotte reached into her inner coat pocket and produced the certified copies. She handed them to Tanner and watched him read, and she watched his deputy read over his shoulder. And she watched the specific progression of Burl Tanner's face as a man who had spent 11 years working within a system confronted documentation that suggested the system had been tilted in ways he either hadn't known or had chosen not to examine. "Caldwell's banking practices," Tanner said, reading the commission ruling. "Documented violation of the 1882 Act," Charlotte said. "By a 2-to-1 vote of the Territorial Banking Commission. The referral to the Attorney General is at the bottom of the 2nd page." Tanner turned to the 2nd page. He read. He was quiet for what felt like a full minute. "Burl," Caleb said quietly, not pressing, just present. Tanner looked up. Something had settled in his face, the calculation had concluded, and the answer was written there. "I'll find out who issued that court order," he said. "And I'll find out where those 4 men went." He folded the documents carefully and handed them back to Charlotte. "You keep those safe, Miss Bennett." "I intend to," she said. Tanner and his deputy left. Hector watched them go and then looked at Caleb. "He going to do anything?" "Something moved in him," Caleb said. "Whether it's enough, we'll see." Charlotte was already thinking past Tanner. She was doing what she had been doing since Cheyenne, mapping the shape of the situation, finding where the pressure points were and which ones Caldwell could still reach. The federal claim was untouchable. The commission ruling was documented and referred upward. The falsified survey discrepancy was in the waterproof case currently sitting in Hector's hands, retrieved from the root cellar with the specific care of a man who understood he had been entrusted with something important. What Caldwell had left was the territorial court, Judge Webb, Friday night card games, and 20 years of understanding. "He's going to go to Webb," she said. Caleb looked at her. "The commission ruling strips his banking complaint. The federal claim takes the mineral rights out of territorial jurisdiction. So the only lever he has left is Webb and whatever a sympathetic judge can manufacture. She looked at him steadily. We need August Pitts. Pitts is the county recorder, Caleb said. He's got no standing in a court proceeding. He is standing as a witness, Charlotte said. He was there the day of the auction. He counted the gold. He certified the debt is settled. If Webb tries to revisit the auction outcome, Pitt's testimony is what establishes the timeline. She paused. And Pitt sent us that warning letter. He's already decided which side he's on. He just needs someone to give him a structure to be useful inside. Caleb studied her. You want to go see him? Tonight, she said. Before Caldwell gets to him first. Hector cleared his throat. I'll watch the ranch. I'll go with you, Daniel said. He was younger than Hector, quieter, with the particular quality of a person who had been underestimated enough times that he'd stopped announcing himself and just did things. I know the back road into town. Nobody sees us go in. Charlotte looked at Caleb. 20 minutes, he said. Let Hector eat something and let me look at the case. He opened the case on the kitchen table while Hector built up the fire for a quick meal, and Charlotte sat across from him. And they went through everything one more time, not because either of them had forgotten what was in it, but because the act of going through it together had become a specific kind of preparation. A way of entering the next difficult thing from a position of shared clarity. The falsified survey, he said. This is the piece that takes everything else and makes it a pattern rather than an argument. A pattern is harder to dismiss than an argument, she agreed. Webb can dismiss an argument. Disputed interpretation, conflicting evidence, further review required. He tapped the survey discrepancy report. A falsified official document is not an interpretation. It's a crime. And a judge who helps a man escape accountability for a crime goes from being a partial judge to being an accessory after the fact. Charlotte looked at him. You think that matters to Webb. I think it matters to Webb's instinct for self-preservation, Caleb said. Which is a different thing and considerably more reliable. She almost smiled. You've thought about this. I've thought about everything else, he said. This seemed like a reasonable next thing. They rode into Red Canyon just after 9 in the evening. Daniel leading them through the back roads with the confident knowledge of a man who had grown up in these streets, before Caldwell had made them complicated. The town had a specific quality at night that Charlotte hadn't seen before, a kind of watchful quiet that felt different from ordinary evening stillness. August Pitts answered the door in his nightshirt and looked at the three of them on his porch, with the expression of a man who had been expecting something and wasn't entirely surprised that the something had arrived at this hour. Come in, he said before any of them spoke. His wife was already up, already dressed, which told Charlotte that Pitts had prepared his household for a late-night conversation that might need witnesses. She was a small woman named Ruth who brought them coffee and sat in the corner of the parlor with her knitting and did not pretend she wasn't listening. He's going to Webb, August Pitts said, before Charlotte could begin. We know, she said. When? Tomorrow morning. He's filing a motion to void the auction settlement on grounds that the paying party lacked clean title to the funds used. Pitts looked at Caleb. He's found someone willing to claim the gold in your payment was part of a disputed estate. The room went very still. A disputed estate, Caleb said. A man named Greer, not Dave Greer. His brother Wade filed an affidavit this afternoon, claiming you owe money to his late father's estate and that the funds you used were assets of that estate that you removed without authorization. Pitts set down his coffee cup. It's completely manufactured. But if Webb accepts it as grounds for a hearing, it gives him another 6 months of procedural fog. Charlotte looked at Caleb. Wade Greer. Caleb's jaw was set. I bought land from the Greer family 7 years ago. Paid in full. Wade was the youngest. He wasn't party to the transaction. He was 15 years old. He paused. He's been Caldwell's man for 3 years now. Odd jobs. The kind that don't get written down. Can you prove the purchase? Charlotte asked. I have the deed at the ranch. We need it tonight, she said. Daniel was already at the door. Pitts looked at Charlotte. There's something else, he said. He had the expression of a man carrying something heavier than the thing he'd just put down. "I've been going through the land office records. The filings that came through in the 2 years before your father took out the loan." He reached into the drawer of the side table beside his chair and produced a folded set of papers. "Caldwell filed a mineral exploration application on the northeast section of the Bennett property 14 months ago." Charlotte stared at him. "He filed on our land." "He filed on land he didn't own yet," Pitts said. "Which is not technically illegal for an exploration application. You can file intent to explore on adjacent or neighboring property under certain circumstances. But the application requires disclosure of any known mineral assessments of the subject area." He opened the papers to a specific page. He listed none. The silence in the room had a particular quality, the silence of a room in which everyone present understood simultaneously that they have just been handed the thing that changes the shape of the entire story. He knew, Charlotte said, at the time of filing. He had already had his own survey done. He knew the deposit was there, and he listed no known mineral assessment. "On a federal exploration application," Caleb said. His voice was very quiet. "That's not a territorial banking violation. That's federal fraud." August Pitts looked at him. "Yes," he said, "it is." Ruth in the corner had stopped knitting. Charlotte looked at the papers. She looked at Pitts. She thought about this man, a county recorder in a small Wyoming town. A man who sat across from Richard Caldwell at official proceedings and stamped documents and filed things, and watched the machinery of Caldwell's power run through his office for years. A man who had sent a warning letter in the night and opened his door at 9 in the evening and reached into his desk drawer for papers he had been gathering while they were in Cheyenne. "How long have you had these?" she asked. "I noticed the discrepancy 6 months ago," Pitts said. "I've been waiting." He looked at her steadily. "For someone to be in a position to use them safely." Same words Caleb had used. Almost exactly. Charlotte felt the full architecture of what her father had built settle into place around her, not a spontaneous network of sympathetic strangers, but a deliberately constructed system of people who had each been given a piece and had waited, trusting, for the moment when the pieces could be assembled. "He trusted all of you," she said. "He trusted you," Pitt said. "We were just holding things until you got here." Daniel came back 40 minutes later with the deed to the Caleb's land purchase from the Greer family clean. Complete, witnessed, and filed at the time of transaction. Showing full payment. Charlotte looked at it alongside the Greer affidavit Pitts had obtained a copy of and felt the specific satisfaction of watching a manufactured accusation collide with an irrefutable fact. "Wade Greer lied on a sworn affidavit," she said. "To a territorial court," Caleb said. "Which is perjury. Which is something Judge Webb is going to know before he accepts the motion tomorrow morning," Charlotte said. She looked at Pitts. "Can you be at the courthouse when Webb convenes?" "I can be there," Pitts said. "With these papers." "With these papers," he agreed. "And the federal exploration application with the false disclosure." Pitts looked at the papers in his hand. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I'll carry whatever you need me to carry." They went back to the ranch in the small hours of the morning, and Charlotte slept 3 hours and was awake again before first light. Sitting at Caleb's kitchen table, going through everything one final time. She heard him moving in the main room, and then he came to the kitchen doorway and looked at her with the early morning directness that was, she had discovered, his most unguarded quality before the day's events gave him things to manage. He was simply himself, present and clear-eyed and without armor. "You should sleep more," he said. "I know," she said. "Come look at this." He came and sat across from her, and she walked him through the complete sequence she had constructed: the Banking Commission ruling, the federal mining claim, the Greer deed, and the perjured affidavit. And now the federal exploration application with the false disclosure. 5 separate instruments, 5 separate jurisdictions, 5 separate angles of approach, each of which was independently damaging and which together constituted something that no single territorial judge could manage, dismiss, or contain. Caleb listened. He asked 2 questions. Both were good questions, and she had answers for both. and when she finished, he sat back and looked at the table with the expression of a man who has watched a complicated piece of machinery click into its final configuration. "Webb is not going to touch this," he said. "Webb is going to have the documents in his hand before Caldwell gets there," Charlotte said. "I want Pitts to file the federal exploration fraud disclosure with the county clerk first thing this morning, before the courthouse opens, so that when Caldwell arrives with his motion, there is already a document on file in that building that says the word federal fraud. Caldwell will see it as a declaration of war," Caleb said. "It is a declaration of war," Charlotte said. "I've been at war with him for 6 weeks. I'm just now fighting it in the open." He looked at her for a long moment. In the early light, his face had the quality of something that had been through weather and come out on the other side of it not unchanged, but more itself, the way certain things become more themselves through difficulty rather than less. "Your father would be proud," he said, "not as a consolation. As a fact." "I know," she said. They were at the courthouse at 8 in the morning, Charlotte. Caleb, Pitts, Hector, and Daniel, who had apparently decided without being asked that he was part of whatever this was. Pitts had filed the federal disclosure with the county clerk at 7:45. The clerk, a woman named Mrs. Garrett, who had worked in that office for 22 years and had the specific quality of a person who did not forget anything she filed, had stamped it without comment and put it in the morning's official record. Caldwell arrived at 8:30. He came with 2 men from Laramie who had the expensive, assured quality of professionals who were paid to be confident, and 3 of the men who worked for him. And he walked into the courthouse with the bearing of a man who owned the building and everything in it. He saw Charlotte immediately. He saw Caleb beside her. He saw August Pitts with a set of papers under his arm, and something shifted in his face, not fear. Not yet, but the first recognition that the morning was not going to be what he had arranged. He looked at his lead lawyer. The lawyer leaned in and said something Charlotte couldn't hear. Caldwell's jaw tightened. Judge Webb came out of his chambers at 9 and took his seat and walked around the courtroom with the expression of a man who had been told this was a simple procedural matter and was beginning to suspect it wasn't. He looked at Caldwell's lawyers. He looked at Charlotte. He looked at Caleb. He looked at August Pitts, who was the county recorder and had no obvious reason to be in this courtroom at this hour. "I have several items submitted to the court's attention this morning," Webb said carefully. "Yes, Your Honor," said Caldwell's lead lawyer. "We've filed a motion to void." "I have that motion," Webb said. "I also have, as of this morning's record, a disclosure filing referencing a federal exploration application that appears to contain materially false information." He looked at Pitts. "Mr. Pitts, is this your filing?" "It is, Your Honor," Pitts said. "Filed this morning at 7:45. I have the original federal application and a comparison document when showing the discrepancy in the minerals assessment disclosure." The courtroom was very quiet. Caldwell's lead lawyer looked at his colleague. His colleague looked at his notes. "I also," Webb continued, and his voice had taken on the careful quality of a man picking his way through something dangerous. "Documentation submitted by Miss Bennett indicating a federal mining claim filing and a banking commission ruling, both certified, and a deed showing clear title to funds disputed in the motion before me." He set down the papers. He looked at the courtroom. "Mr. Harwell," to Caldwell's lawyer, "I'd like you to explain to me how the Greer affidavit your motion relies on squares with a fully executed and filed deed showing payment in full, signed and witnessed, dated 7 years ago." Harwell was quiet for exactly 3 seconds too long. "Your Honor," he began. "Mr. Harwell," Webb said, "I'm going to be direct with you, because I think directness is warranted this morning. I have a motion before me that relies on a sworn affidavit that appears to contradict a public record. I have a federal fraud disclosure sitting in this county's official record that was filed this morning. And I have federal documentation that establishes this court's jurisdiction over the central matter is substantially limited." He looked at Harwell. "I am not in a position to accept this motion as filed." Caldwell stood up. Richard Webb said. The single word had a quality to it, not a reprimand, but the sound of a man drawing a line that he had not drawn before, and that both of them understood the significance of. Caldwell looked at Webb for a long moment. He looked at Charlotte. He looked at Caleb. He looked at August Pitts and his papers, and at the courtroom full of people who had come in off the street when word spread. The way word spread in small towns, that something was happening in the courthouse that was worth watching. Charlotte met his eyes and held them. She did not speak. She did not need to. Everything she needed to say to Richard Caldwell was already in a stamped and filed document in the official record of 3 separate jurisdictions. Caldwell turned and walked out. His lawyers followed. And then his men and the courtroom watched them go with the specific collective exhale of people who have been holding their breath longer than they realized. Caleb's hand found hers under the table. Not a gesture of victory, something quieter than that. A pressure, brief and certain, from a man who had come down from a mountain to keep a promise and had stayed because the woman he'd come for had turned out to be worth staying for. She held it for a moment and then they both let go. Because there was still more to do, and they both knew it. Webb looked at Charlotte. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I'm going to recommend that this court refer the federal exploration application matter to the U.S. District Attorney's Office. I want you to understand that this is not a resolution of the matter, it's a beginning of a formal federal process, I understand." "Your Honor," she said, "I've been preparing for a long beginning." Webb looked at her for a moment with something that might, in different circumstances, have been respect. "I imagine you have," he said. Outside the courthouse, Pitts let out a long breath and looked at Charlotte. "That's the first time I've seen Webb not rule in Caldwell's direction in 11 years. He saw where this was going," Caleb said. "He made a choice about which side of it he wanted to be on. Fear is useful sometimes," Charlotte said. Hector was grinning, which was apparently something he did not do often enough, that Daniel looked slightly startled. Daniel himself had the expression of a young man who had been present at something he would describe to people for years and was trying to look like this was ordinary. Charlotte looked down the main street of Red Canyon. This town that had watched her father build something for 30 years and had crossed the street to avoid her when that something was threatened. She was not going to pretend the morning had changed everything. Caldwell was still in Red Canyon. The federal process Webb had referenced was going to take months. The 4 men who had burned Caleb's outbuilding had not been charged with anything yet. But the shape of things had changed, irrevocably, in the specific way that public records change things. The documents were filed. The rulings were issued. The disclosure was in the official record. And none of that could be undone. Caldwell could apply pressure, could maneuver, could spend money on lawyers from Laramie who came and left with their motions unaccepted. But the ground under his feet was different this morning than it had been yesterday. She turned to Caleb. He was watching her with the expression she had come to know best, the one that wasn't a question and wasn't a statement, but was simply his attention. His full and genuine attention, given to her specifically. "The ranch," she said. "We should go back, yes." "Ma'am." She almost said something about the ma'am, about how he had used it since the first day, and what it meant from him. Which was not distance or formality, but something closer to the Western courtesy that her father had always told her was the politest form of respect. She decided to let it stay. They walked to the horses. And behind them the town of Red Canyon did what it had not done in 6 weeks. It moved. Doors opened. People came out of shops. Tom Aldridge walked toward them from the hardware store without crossing to the other side of the street. And when they passed him, he touched his hat to Charlotte, and she nodded back. And it was a small thing, and it was not forgiveness, and it was a beginning. Riding back toward the mountain, with the sun at the right angle, and the documents safe, and the federal machinery finally pointed in the correct direction. Charlotte felt something shift in her chest that was not triumph and not relief, but something more quiet and more lasting than either. "He's not done," she said. "He's going to come at us again. Probably. And we're going to be ready. Caleb looked at her. The gray horse moved steadily beneath him. We're going to be ready, he said. The word we settled between them, like something that had always been there waiting. Like a piece of a map that clicks into place and suddenly shows you that you have been in a known country all along. Charlotte let it settle. She did not examine it or qualify it or decide what it meant beyond what it plainly meant: two people who had chosen to face the same direction, on the same road, going toward the same thing. Ahead of them, the mountain waited, permanent, indifferent, asking nothing. Already home, 3 weeks after the courthouse morning, a federal marshal rode into Red Canyon. His name was Elias Cross, and he came from the U.S. District Attorney's Office in Denver, with 2 deputies and a leather satchel full of documents, and the particular bearing of a man who had been sent specifically because the people who sent him wanted the thing done correctly and completely. He went first to the courthouse, then to the county recorder's office. Then on the second day he rode north toward the mountain. Charlotte saw him coming from the yard. She had been working with Hector on the fence line, along the eastern property, her property, the Bennett land, where she had moved back to 2 weeks after the courthouse morning, once Caleb had satisfied himself that Caldwell's immediate capacity for direct action had been sufficiently curtailed. She had fixed the gate her father had been meaning to fix for 2 years. She had cleared the kitchen and opened the windows, and let the summer air move through rooms that had been closed and grieving for too long. She watched Marshal Cross ride up and felt Caleb come to stand beside her. He had been there more often than not these past weeks, riding down from the north slope in the mornings and staying through the day's work, which was partly practical and partly something neither of them had found the exact words for yet. Marshal, Caleb said, when Cross dismounted. Whitmore. Cross looked at Charlotte. Miss Bennett. I've come to give you a formal update on the federal proceedings. They sat at her kitchen table, her father's kitchen table, where she had read his papers in the dark of early morning for 6 weeks and found nothing, and where she now sat across from a federal marshal with Caleb beside her and the sun coming through the window at the angle her father had always said was the best light in the house. Cross opened his satchel. Richard Caldwell had been formally charged by the U.S. District Attorney's Office with federal fraud in connection with the falsified mineral disclosure on his exploration application. Canyon Trust and Lending was under federal review for predatory lending practices. The investigation encompassing not just the Bennett debt but 11 other loans Caldwell had issued in Albany County over the past 8 years at interest rates that violated the 1882 Banking Regulation Act. Wade Greer had been charged with perjury in connection with the affidavit he had filed in the territorial court motion. Judge Webb and here Cross paused briefly, with the professional delicacy of a man delivering news about a public official, had submitted a voluntary recusal from any further proceedings related to Caldwell or his holdings, accompanied by a written statement cooperating with the federal review. Charlotte listened to all of it without interrupting. When Cross finished, he looked at her with the expression of a man accustomed to delivering news to people who responded with tears or anger or relief so large it needed to go somewhere physical. He seemed slightly uncertain about a woman who received all of it quietly, with her hands flat on the table and her eyes clear. Miss Bennett, he said, or do you have questions? The 11 other loans, she said. The other families. Cross looked at his papers. Several of them resulted in completed foreclosures. The federal review will determine whether restitution is applicable in those cases. Applicable, she said. Does that mean possible or likely? Given the documentation Miss Pitts pardon that Mr. Pitts has provided, and the commission ruling already on record, I would say likely in most cases. He paused. It will take time. How much time? 18 months. Possibly 2 years for full resolution. Charlotte nodded. She had expected something in that range. She had been making calculations for 2 weeks about what happened after the legal proceedings resolved. And what happened in the 18 months before they did. and what a community that had been living under Caldwell's financial thumb for 20 years was going to need as it found its feet. "The silver claim," Caleb said. He said it quietly. And Cross looked at him. "The federal mining claim filed by Miss Bennett is confirmed and active," Cross said. "The falsified survey Caldwell's man filed does not supersede it. The northeast quarter section is unambiguously Bennett land, and the mineral rights are fully hers." He looked at Charlotte. "You'll need to decide how you want to proceed with development. There are legitimate mining operations that buy claims outright. Or you can pursue extraction through a licensed operator with royalty arrangements." "I know," Charlotte said. "I've been looking at the options." Cross looked at her steadily. "Miss Bennett, I want to be direct with you. What you and Mr. Whitmore put together, the documentation, the commission referral, the federal application discrepancy, that was not a simple thing. Most people in your situation, facing the resources Caldwell had behind him, don't make it to a federal filing in Cheyenne. Most people in my situation," Charlotte said carefully, "don't have the right people standing with them." She looked at Caleb when she said it. He looked at the table, which she had come to understand was what he did when something hit somewhere that mattered. Cross left an hour later with copies of additional documentation Charlotte had prepared, and they stood in the yard and watched him ride south toward town. And when he was gone, the quiet that came back was a different quality of quiet than any they'd had in the past 6 weeks, not the quiet of waiting, or the quiet of a held breath, or the quiet of two people on a road thinking about the thing chasing them. The quiet of something that has resolved. Caleb looked at her. 2 years, he said. "Give or take," she said. "For full legal resolution, yes." She looked at the yard, at the fence she'd been fixing, at her father's house that was her house now. "That's not the same as 2 years of waiting. There's work to do." She paused. "There are 11 other families." Caleb was quiet. "I've been thinking," she said. "The silver claim, if I license it through a royalty arrangement instead of selling it outright. There's consistent income, not immediately, but within a year. And the land is 412 acres, which is more than I can work alone." She turned to look at him directly. "I want to use it, not just to restore what my father built. To build something different." "Different how?" he asked. Not skeptically, genuinely. "There are families in this county who lost land they shouldn't have lost. Some of them can come back, legally, when the federal review is done. But they need somewhere to go in the meantime. Work, fair wages, a structure that isn't Caldwell's structure." She held his gaze. "I can do that here. I know how to manage accounts, how to run an operation. I've been doing it in my head since Cheyenne." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "You have been doing this in your head since Cheyenne," he said. "Since the second night on the road, actually," she said. "When I understood the full shape of what my father knew." She paused. "I need someone who can assess land properly, who knows what's in the northeast quarter and what it means and how to manage the extraction arrangement with a licensed operator." "You need a land assessor," he said. "I need you," she said. "Plain and direct, no performance around it. Professionally. For the land work. And I would very much like for you to consider whether the rest of it could be something else." The morning was doing what Wyoming summer mornings did at this hour, pressing into the day with the particular certainty of something that knows its own nature and doesn't apologize for it. Caleb stood in it and looked at her and did not say anything immediately, which she had long since stopped interpreting as reluctance, and understood now as the opposite, as a man who did not answer before he was certain. Because his answers meant what he said they meant. "Charlotte," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without the miss in front of it. She felt it the way you feel the first cold morning of autumn, sudden, clarifying, the specific sensation of something changing that had been building toward this change for long enough that when it arrived, it felt both unexpected and inevitable. "The mountain," he said. "I've been up there 6 years. I came down because your father asked me to." He looked at her with his direct, honest eyes. I'm not going back up there to be alone. I don't want that. He paused. I want to know if you'd let me stay. I'm asking you to stay, she said. I just told you I need a land assessor. That's not what I'm asking about. I know, she said. I'm asking about both things at once, the work and the rest of it. I don't see why they have to be separate conversations. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, Your father said you were the most direct woman he'd ever known. My father was right about most things. He was right about you, Caleb said. Something in his face opened, slightly that private. Internal quality he had, that showed itself rarely and without announcement. I'd like to stay, for the work and for the rest of it. Both, she nodded once. She felt something in her settle, not the resolution of the legal proceedings. Not the federal marshal riding away with his documentation. But this specific thing. A man who had kept his word to her dead father, choosing, with full knowledge of what she was and what she asked and what she intended to build, to stay. Then we have a lot to do, she said. Yeah. Ma'am, he said. She looked at him. You're going to keep doing that, the almost smile. Probably. The weeks that followed were the hardest work Charlotte had done in her life. And also the most purposeful, which made them something she got out of bed early for every single morning. She sent letters, not the desperate, searching letters of 6 weeks ago, but specific, detailed, purposeful letters to the 11 families the Federal Review had identified. 3 of them came to see her in the first month. By the second month, 2 families were working the South Pasture on fair wage arrangements. By the third month, the Federal Review had produced its first restitution order, and the Harmon family, who had lost 40 acres to a Caldwell loan 4 years ago, had their deed returned and were back on their land. August Pitts, who turned out to have a gift for community organization that his years behind the county recorder's desk had kept obscured, became the unofficial coordinator of what the town started calling the restoration effort. A name that Charlotte found slightly grand, but did not argue with because the work behind it was real. Ruth Pitts organized the women, Dorothy Marsh, Gerald's wife, who had brought over the pie and wouldn't meet Charlotte's eyes, showed up one morning in September with a covered dish and an expression of plain, unornamented regret, and asked what she could do. Charlotte put her to work teaching the children of 2 displaced families the schoolroom hours their own schooling had been disrupted by. Gerald Marsh himself resigned from Canyon Trust and Lending in August, citing a change in circumstances, which was the most words he had used to describe anything in his professional life. He came to Charlotte privately, 2 weeks after his resignation, with a folder of internal loan documents that he had retained copies of and that he believed were relevant to the Federal Review. He had the look of a man who had been waiting for permission to be better than his circumstances had required of him. Charlotte took the documents. She did not tell him she forgave him, because forgiveness was a thing she gave privately, in her own time, not as a transaction. But she thanked him for the documents, and she meant it, and he left looking lighter than he'd arrived. Tom Aldridge donated lumber for the repair of the Bennett barn roof. He did it without being asked and without announcing it, which Charlotte respected more than she would have respected an announcement. She told him so, and he looked at the ground, and she let him look. Caleb's outbuilding, the one Caldwell's men had burned, went up again in October. Rebuilt in 2 days by 8 men who showed up on a Saturday morning with tools and no particular ceremony about it. Hector organized it. Caleb watched the first 2 hours from the fence with an expression that saw from across the yard and that she carried with her quietly, because it was the expression of a man who had spent 6 years on a mountain, deciding that his best work wasn't worth the world's having, and who was finding out, incrementally and irrevocably, that he had been wrong about that. The federal fraud charges against Caldwell were formally indicted in October. His lawyers from Laramie filed responses and countermotions with the professional thoroughness of men who were paid to slow things down. And the process proceeded at the pace federal processes proceeded. which was deliberate and unstoppable in the way of things that cannot be rushed but also cannot be stopped. Wade Greer pleaded guilty to perjury in November and received a suspended sentence conditional on full cooperation with the federal review, which he provided with the thoroughness of a man who had decided the person he'd been working for was no longer worth the ongoing cost. Canyon Trust and Lending was placed under federal conservatorship in November. Its assets, including the land it had acquired through the loans under review, were frozen pending the outcome of the review. Richard Caldwell was living in his house, attending to his remaining legitimate holdings, and doing something he had not done in 20 years, waiting for other people to decide what happened to him. Charlotte heard this from Marshall Cross, who had made 2 more visits by December. And she received the information the way she received most things now, with attention and without drama. Filing it against the larger picture and determining what action, if any, it required from her. What it required from her, she had decided, was exactly what she was already doing. It was a Sunday in December when Caleb found her in her father's study, her study now, reorganized and working, the walls still holding the particular quality of all the evenings her father had spent there, going through the royalty arrangement documents that the licensed mining operator had sent for her review. The Northeast Quarter had been under preliminary extraction assessment since October, and the first royalty projections were, by any measure Charlotte applied to them, extraordinary. "You've been in here 3 hours," Caleb said from the doorway. "The projections came," she said. She held up the relevant page. "Look at this." He came in and looked at it. He looked at it for a moment and then set it back down on the desk with the care of a man handling something that deserved care. "Your father would have," he started. "I know," she said. "He would have found a way to be completely matter-of-fact about it," Caleb said. "He would have said something like, 'The land always provided,' and then gone back to whatever he was doing." Charlotte looked at the projection page. "He always said the land was worth more than people thought," she said. "He said it like it was about the farming. It wasn't about the farming." "No," Caleb said. "He knew exactly what was in that ground. He knew and he protected it," she said. "For 30 years, he worked that land and paid those taxes and built those relationships, and he never told anyone what was underneath it. Not until he had to." She looked at the page and thought about her father in the evenings, reading aloud the particular sound of his voice on certain passages he had loved. She thought about him riding up the mountain to hire a surveyor and finding a man who had lost things and understood what it cost to keep going. She thought about the letter he had written with a hand that was starting to show the fever trust him. Fight for it. She had done both, Caleb, she said. Yes, he said. He was still standing beside the desk, close enough that she could have reached out and found his hand without looking. "I want to tell you something that isn't about the legal proceedings, or the land or the operation," she said. He waited. "When you came to that auction," she said, "I was already past asking anyone for help. I had asked every person I could think to ask and gotten nothing. And I had decided that I was going to face that morning alone, and whatever came after it, I was going to face it alone." She looked up at him. "And then you came through that crowd and stood beside me." "Not in front of me. Beside me." "Yes," he said. "That was the thing," she said. "Not the gold, not the legal citation, not the speech to Caldwell." She held his gaze. "The beside. That was the thing I had stopped believing was possible." Caleb was very still in the way that meant he was feeling something fully and not managing it, just holding it. "I was alone on that mountain for 3 years," he said. "After Ellen and the boy," he said their names Ellen, with the plainness of a man who had learned to carry something without letting it hollow him. "I told myself I preferred it. The quiet, the work. Not needing anyone to understand what I was doing or why." He paused. "Your father came up there and hired me and talked to me like a man who already understood. And I thought that was going to be the last time. That I was used up for that." "But," Charlotte said. "But then I came down to keep a promise," he said. And the woman at the end of it turned out to be. He stopped. He looked at her with complete honesty, the armor entirely gone. You turned out to be the reason I came down the mountain and can't figure out how to go back up. Charlotte stood up from the desk. She was not a woman given to gesture over words, but there are moments when words have done what words can do, and what comes next is something else. She put her hand against his face, just her palm. Flat and certain against the short beard and the weathered skin and the jaw of a man who had been up on a mountain for 3 years deciding the world didn't deserve his best work, and he went very still under it. And then his hand came up and covered hers and held it there. "Stay," she said. "I already told you I would," he said. "I'm telling you again," she said. Differently. He turned his head slightly. Just enough, and pressed his lips against the inside of her wrist where her pulse was. And it was not a dramatic gesture, and it was not a small one. And Charlotte felt it travel through her, the way certain things travel, not like a shock, but like a key turning in a lock that has been locked so long you had stopped noticing the absence of the key. They stood like that for a moment that had no particular length. Outside, the December air was doing what December air does in Wyoming, making itself known. Making the inside of a house feel more itself by contrast. The study smelled of paper and old wood, and the particular smell that belongs to a room where someone has done serious work for a long time. Charlotte lowered her hand. Caleb kept hold of it for a moment, and then let go, and they stood in the quiet that was now a completely different category of quiet than any they'd inhabited, before the quiet of two people who have said the thing that needed saying and are now standing in the aftermath of it, which is not silence so much as the opening of something. "The spring," she said. "When the extraction separation gets properly underway, I want to build something." "You've been telling me about building things for 2 months," he said. There was warmth in it. The specific warmth of a man who has listened and remembered. "This is different," she said. "There are families in this county who lost children to illness because there was no doctor closer than 50 miles. My father lost a fever in 4 days because she stopped. I want a medical station, properly staffed. The royalty projections support it." Caleb looked at her. "And the school is too small," she said. "It always has been. 400 acres supports a bigger community than what's there now. And a bigger community needs a proper school." "Charlotte," he said. "I know it's a lot," she said. "I know it takes time. I'm not in a hurry in the sense of being impatient. I'm in a hurry in the sense of knowing exactly what I want and not seeing a reason to approach it indirectly." "I know," he said. "That's not what I was going to say." She looked at him. "I was going to say," he said, "that you're going to need someone to assess the foundation sites. For the building projects." Something released in her chest that she hadn't known was held. She looked at him, this man. This specific impossible man who had ridden down a mountain to keep a promise, and had stayed because she asked him to, and was now standing in her father's study, talking about foundation assessments for buildings that didn't exist yet, and she felt. What she felt without examining it or qualifying it or deciding what category it belonged in. "I happen to know a land assessor," she said. "I've heard he's reliable," Caleb said. She reached out and took his hand. He let her. His grip was solid and unhurried. The grip of a man who was not going anywhere. The federal proceedings moved through their phases, as federal proceedings do, with the grinding certainty of a machine that does not speed up for urgency and does not slow down for opposition. By the following summer, Richard Caldwell had accepted a plea arrangement with the U.S. District Attorney that included substantial fines, the dissolution of Canyon Trust and Lending, and a permanent bar from operating financial institutions in the territory. It was not, Marshall Cross told Charlotte when he delivered the news, everything the evidence would have supported at trial. But it was certain, and it was final, and it removed Caldwell's mechanisms entirely. Charlotte received this news in her yard on a July morning exactly 1 year after the auction. She was standing with Caleb and Hector and August Pitts, who had become a regular presence at the Bennett operation, because there was always something that needed recording, and because he and Ruth had both discovered that they liked being where things were happening. The Harmon family was working the south fence line. 3 children were crossing the yard on their way to the expanded schoolroom that had been finished in April. She heard Cross out completely. Then she said, "What about the 11 families? 8 restitution orders have been issued and executed," Cross said. 2 cases are still under review. One family, the Marshalls, lost their primary homesteader. The land is restored, but there's nobody left to work it. Charlotte looked at August Pitts. "I know a family looking for land," Pitts said immediately, because he had become a man who always knew a family looking for something. The Garcias came up from New Mexico Territory last year. Good workers, nowhere to settle. Charlotte looked cross. Is there a process for the Marshall land to be transferred rather than just restored to a vacant estate? Cross thought about it. That's a question for the Territorial Land Office, he said. Under the current circumstances, he meant under the circumstances in which the Territorial Land Office was no longer being run by a man with an arrangement with Caldwell. I believe there are mechanisms. Then we'll pursue it, Charlotte said. She looked at Pitts. Can you make contact with the Garcia family this week? I'll go today, Pitts said. Cross watched this exchange. He had made 4 visits to Red Canyon over the past year, and each time he had come expecting a woman managing a legal situation and found instead something that had grown considerably past that, a functional, self-organizing community doing what communities do when the thing that was suppressing them is removed. Which is to say, Miss Bennett, he said, I want you to know the documentation you and Mr. Whitmore assembled made this possible, the clarity of it. The federal case was built on what you brought to Cheyenne. The documentation was my father's work, Charlotte said. And Caleb's. I assembled it. Yes, Cross said. And without the assembly it was just pieces. He looked at her steadily. Don't diminish the assembly. She received that with a nod. Cross rode out for the last time, and Charlotte stood in the July sun and let the year settle around her, all of it. The full weight and texture of it. The auction morning and the mountain and the road to Cheyenne and the courtroom and the burning outbuilding and Caleb's hand covering hers and her father's letter and August Pitts's drawer full of papers and Tom Aldridge's lumber and Dorothy Marsh's covered dish and all the mornings she had gotten up early because there was work to do and all the evenings she had sat at the table with Caleb going through documents and the one evening in the study in December and all the days between then and this one. Caleb came to stand beside her. It's done, he said. It's done, she said. How does that feel? She thought about it honestly. Like a beginning, she said. He looked at her. Your father said something to me the last time I saw him, he said. 2 months before he died, he said the end of a fight is just the start of the life you were fighting for. Charlotte pressed her lips together briefly. She breathed. She looked at the yard, at the people in it, at the land beyond it, at the mountains above that. Permanent and indifferent and enormous, and she had come to understand. Not indifferent at all, because the mountains had given her father the thing he had protected and had given her the man who had kept his word and had given that man, after 3 years of solitude, something worth coming down for. He was right, she said. Caleb reached over and took her hand in full daylight. In front of Hector and August Pitts and Ruth and Daniel and the Harmon family at the south fence line, and 3 children's crossing the yard and the entire July morning. And held it the way he held things he intended to keep. Yes, he said, he usually was. And Charlotte Bennett, who had stood alone at an auction podium with her hand out for justice in a room full of people who had decided not to see her, stood in her own yard in the summer sun, with her hand in the hand of a man who had never once failed to stand beside her, and felt not the relief of survival, not the satisfaction of a legal victory, not even the particular vindication of watching a wrong be corrected, but something quieter and more complete than all of those things. She felt for the first time since the fever had taken her father in 4 days, that the ground beneath her feet was solid and that it was hers, and that she was not standing on it alone. That was everything her father had fought for. That was everything she had fought for. And it was, in the end, exactly enough.